Patten. Lord Patten, who was the last British governor of Hong Kong and former chairman of the BBC. Lord Patten, welcome to you. Thanks very much for joining us. What's your reaction to the imminent closure of Apple Daily?
Well, it's profoundly sad. It's another example of Beijing with a quisling administration in Hong Kong to help it, setting about destroying the freedoms, the liberties, and eroding the rule of law in Hong Kong. The media group that's they're closing down was founded by Jimmy Lai, who was himself, like so many people in Hong Kong, a refugee from the brutalities and the repression of the Chinese Communist Party in China itself. He started this paper, which is the most successful and very prosperous in Hong Kong. I think they have a circulation of over 600,000. They had, when their assets were frozen, 500 million in the bank, so they could have gone on at least for another 18 months as they are. But in a vengeful attack on a newspaper, which is not surprising given the experience of so many refugees from communism, supported democracy and the rule of law, in a vengeful attack, they're determined just to turn Hong Kong into a part of the surveillance state in China. And it speaks to every believer in freedom and to every journalist and media organization that this is what the Chinese Communist Party is like. It's a threat to our values, and we should recognize it as that.
As you said, the paper financially at least could have carried on for some time. Ronnie Tong, non-official member of the Hong Kong Executive Council, also made this point and said that actually this was a strategic move by the paper. What do you say to that?
A strategic move by the paper? It's a terrible, tyrannous move by the Beijing regime and by the government in Hong Kong, which simply does what it's told. Look, what we know about Beijing, we know that they break their word and they lie. There were promises made to Hong Kong, tabled in a treaty at the UN, that it would have its autonomy and that its rule of law and its freedoms for 50 years after 1997. And the Chinese Communist Party is terrified of what Hong Kong represents. It's an existential threat, they think, because it stands for freedom, it stands for the rule of law, it stands for freedom of expression. It's newspapers that enable us to know how much corruption is starting to seep into Hong Kong. President Xi Jinping's communist cronies and families try to get their money into Hong Kong so they can safeguard their ill-gotten gains. So the fact that newspapers can expose that, as well as point out the other appalling ways in which democracy has been curtailed, has been put in handcuffs in Hong Kong, that's the reason for this dismal act. And I'm afraid that the police service, which used to be regarded as Asia's finest, is being used, 500 or 600 of them raiding the Apple Daily office, parading journalists, looking at journalists' IT equipment and at their files. Every newspaper in the free world, every journalist in the free world is represented by those brave Apple journalists who've been standing up for the things we take for granted.
When you oversaw the handover of power to China back in the 1990s, the British government committed to oversee freedom of speech and to uphold that. Now, we know that over the past year, the British government has said that it will allow some Hong Kongers here into the UK if they so choose to leave. Should they be doing more now, do you think?
Yes, and I'm sure they will be. I have many disagreements with the present government, but I think they've been pretty good in speaking up about Hong Kong. I would like to see them do that even more loudly and do it with our colleagues in the international community, not just in the Americas and in Europe, but in Asia as well. President Biden is actually recognizing, I think, that in order to deal with the appalling coercive bullying, the attack on our values by the Chinese Communist Party, all of us who believe in freedom have to stand together. And newspapers and media organizations, seeing what's happening in Hong Kong, need to stand together. When I was governor, we had Beijing-backed newspapers, Takampo and Wenwei Po, all of them still working. We didn't try to close them down. They published lies and fabrications about the government. That's part of living in a free society, but not if you're a Chinese communist, because you feel threatened by other people living in freedom.
OK, Lord